Good morning, C2. Buenos dias, Iglesia C2. We're just going to stay in the dark for a little bit since it's so peaceful and relaxing. If you just want to take a second and actually, an old youth pastor that used to tell me, it wasn't Pastor Jeremy, he was my youth pastor, so I won't blame this on him. I had an old youth pastor that told me once that I was having troubles in church keeping my eyes open, and my head was kind of nodding, and he caught me, and he told me, he said, Ben, he whispered, he said, there's no better place to rest than in the presence of the Lord. And I just went, anyway, it wasn't Pastor Jeremy who told me that, so I can't blame it on him. But it is so good to be with you. Tan bueno estar con ustedes esta mañana. Me gustaría comenzar. I just want to say on behalf, I know I can speak for the staff in this way, but I want to say on behalf of our whole staff team and pastoral team, I just want to say a huge thank you and to everyone who, the cards, the conversations, the smiles, the hugs, the gifts that you guys have just showered on us. This has been incredible. And to be honest, it's hard to feel like worthy of that kind of recognition. And so I just want to say thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your love. It means so much. So many of the, even like our kids, those are some of my favorite cards. I got one of our kids thanked me for being like their best friend ever. And I was like, I didn't even know I was your best friend ever, but man, our connection has just grown. So anyway, but yes, thank you for that. I know our whole pastoral team has been so blessed by your words and your encouragement. And we hope that we would be of similar blessing to you in the year to come. I also would like to take a moment in that same vein, as a member of our staff, I'm so grateful for our lead pastor and not just the position and the role that he fulfills, but the person he is as someone who just gets to be around him all the time. I feel like sometimes a work environment can kind of be like marriage. When you're around someone, you get to know them, the real them, that other people don't always see. And if I can, just to be completely honest with you, Pastor Jeremy is the real deal when he's off the mic. And the way that he leads, example in humility and refusal to self-exalt, but to exalt others and to push people forward, to believe in the best that God had for them, to release them into ministry is such a blessing to me and to our whole team. And so I just want to take a moment and express that appreciation publicly. Nuestro pastor es lo mejor que tenemos. Es una gran bendición tener el pastor que Dios nos ha dado. Así que we can give him a hand. Can we take a moment? I would like to pray for him. He's feeling under the weather today. I'd like to take a moment to pray for him for healing. I know Matt did earlier, but we're just going to say ditto to what Matt said and pray one more time. Is that cool? Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you so much for our lead pastor. We thank you for the ways that you have gifted us and blessed us by his leadership, by his service, God, by his surrendered heart, Father, to your will and your way. And Father, we ask that right now you would fill his body with peace, with strength, with energy. You would clear his mind. Father, I just pray that the time that he is right now with you in your presence, God, I pray that it would be sweet. I pray that it would be replenishment to his body, to his mind, to his heart. God, and we thank you. We ask that you would continue to strengthen him, be his strength. That when every time he is weak, we ask that your strength would be perfected in him and through him. Guard him, Jesus, and protect him. And we thank you for the blessing that he is in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. I don't know if we have any card players in the room. Si tenemos algunas personas que juegan tarjetas, sí. No sé cómo se dice en español, tarjetas. Cartas, ¿va? Cartas. I don't know if we have any card players or card sharks in the room. It kind of feels funny to talk about cards from stage because I feel like I could be wrong. Someone who's older than me should probably tell me, but I feel like 40 years ago, if you talked about playing cards from the stage, you might have gotten struck by lightning. That in movies, I think. But my family plays quite a bit of cards. I should say quite a bit. When we're together as a family, the few times that everyone kind of gets together, my uncles and aunts, they all play cards, and I'm not very good at cards, so I just come together to get slapped around the room proverbially. My immediate family, my brother, just recently started kind of taking to playing like poker more and more, and not like not with real money, I don't think, so I've started playing poker, and kind of my dad has always enjoyed the game, and we've kind of played together with chips, and it's like, I'm really terrible at poker too. It turns out if you're not good at regular cards, you're probably not going to be very good at poker. And so we'll play, and the strategy that I have in my head when I approach the poker table or the kitchen table to play is, I just feel like generosity is so much a part of who God is and his plan for the world. And so when I come to the table, I just try to come in a generous attitude and just kind of look around the room and say, man, who am I going to bless today? Freely, I've been given these chips, and freely I'm going to give them away. They go pretty fast. I'm not any good. But every time I sit down, I kind of envision in my head, the movie Casino Royale just comes to mind. It's like James. I don't know if we have any James Bond fans in the room, and I'm not necessarily recommending a movie. So all the parents out there, but in the Bond franchise, there's this movie where the whole fate of the world comes down to a Texas Hold'em game. And James Bond is working on behalf of the intelligence community for England, and surrounded by other members of the intelligence community, trying to thwart basically this dastardly plan to ruin happiness and the future of the world. And somehow he's going to do it by playing cards for a ridiculous amount of money. But the whole thing is just like, there's all this tension, there's all this conflict. Hay todo este conflicto en este juego. Like, James Bond is not exactly he's a protagonist, but a very nuanced protagonist, isn't he? He's not just this kind of immortal hero that just kind of like unscathed. He's actually, especially in this movie, he's kind of conflicted. There's conflicts of character for him. There's mistakes made. There's a lot going on. And it's just really intense. The movie is like action, and like there's like all these, like, it's like drinking and wealth and power and sex and all this stuff, right? And for many people, that makes a great action film. That makes a great action flick. And in this movie, it's like, it just seems like everything almost nearly comes down to chance, doesn't it? And it's like this one guy's ability to take advantage of chance and to push it in a direction that would serve him. And the big question that all of this is kind of built on, the reason why everyone's at that table, the reason why in the real world, the reason why people do evil, the reason why intelligence communities act the way they do and try to get an edge, right? We're all familiar with these stories. The reason is, I think at the base of it, comes down to this basic question of, what if? See, we live in a world that is built on the question of, what if? Vivimos en un mundo que está construido sobre el tema, la pregunta de, ¿qué pasaría si? Everyone at that table, with different reasons, different outcomes, different hopes, is thinking, what if? What if? What will happen if we don't remain in control? What will happen if we don't win this card game? What will happen if? What will happen if? What will happen if? And at the basis of this question is fear. And the whole story, the movie of Casino Royale, it's a godless movie. God is not a character in that story. Most movies, actually. Sometimes we are very concerned about content in movies. We're very concerned about, does it have too much violence? Does it have too much sex? Does it have too much drinking? Does it have too much language? And those are all good things to consider. But sometimes I think that the most sneaky of things that we don't really always consider is, does this story speak truth about the world as it is? Or does it actually deny the existence of God? Does it even What direction does this point my heart, right? And it's ironic because we're actually going to look at a story in Scripture this morning that seems quite absent of God. In my mind, it's actually the Casino Royale of the Scriptures, of the Hebrew Old Testament. Just like that film, it's full of darkness, high stakes, treachery, betrayal. It's full of drinking and sex. It's full of ambiguity. The characters, you can't really tell if they're actually always doing what's right. You don't even know their motives. You don't know what's going on. And it's just really, really dark. Everything kind of just seems wrong. And it leaves you wondering what's going to happen. It's interesting, in the story of Esther, God is not mentioned, not even one time. His absence in the story is deafening. Considering the rest of the Bible, he is the central character. He's the mover and shaker. The whole story is about him. And yet in this portion of that story, he's conspicuously absent. So we're going to jump in together to the story. If you go with me to Esther chapter 1. Esther chapter 1 begins with Israel is currently at this point in their history has been taken into exile into Babylon, which then got taken over by the kingdom, the empire of Persia. And in this moment, Israel is in exile. See, Israel was called by God to be a special people, to be a unique, holy people, a sacred people, which simply means this: they were set apart to represent God to the rest of the world. They were to be a kingdom of priests. See, what priests do is priests go into holy places like temples, and they represent people to God, and they represent God to the people. And in order to do this successfully, a priest has to actually go through a series of rituals and has to be in a state of purity to be able to do this. And in fact, the high priest of Israel would once a year go into the temple, the most holy place, once a year to rep people before Yahweh. He would make atonement for their sins, so to speak, and then he would come out and he would actually represent Yahweh to the people, and he would bless the people. This is what priests did. And as a nation, Israel, as a nation among the nations, was supposed to be this for the whole world. They were to be the nation that represented the nations before Yahweh and represented Yahweh to the nations. The only problem is that Israel kept wanting to be like the other nations instead of being different like Yahweh had called them to be. Israel no quería ser diferente como Yahweh quería. Israel siempre se acostumbraba a ser como los países alrededor de ellos. And so Yahweh finally, in the end, gives them what they want, and he scatters them among the nations that they wanted to be like. They had become beasts, just like the beasts of some of the visions of Israel's prophets of the other nations. They had become just like them, and so God scatters them among these nations. And so Israel finds themselves in exile, in Persia, away from their temple, away from anything familiar, experiencing marginalization, of being a minority in a majority culture that did not have any of the same values, struggling to know what faithfulness to Yahweh and his Torah, his instruction, looks like in this new landscape where they have no ability to actually follow any of his law. It's a dark story. And it begins this way. It says in chapter 1, Esther chapter 1, verse 1, estamos en versículo 1 de capítulo 1, Esther. It says, these events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Cush. It's a lot of places. Much of the known world was owned by Persia at this time. It says, in those days, Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress at Susa. Now, what's fascinating here is if you know history, and that this work, Esther, was written about 100 to 150 years or so after the events of Esther took place. Okay, so this is a work that people are reading later. In literary time, in the time of these events, the king is just getting ready to he's calling all his advisors, his noblemen, the leaders of tribes and places where he had conquered. He's calling these leaders together to impress them and buy their loyalty because he's getting ready to go to war against Greece. And the reader is living 100 to 150 years after this. And the reader knows, as they're reading this, that this king is going to go to war against Greece, and he is going to lose all of the wealth of Persia, one of the most wealthy empires in the world. He's going to spend all this wealth on a failed war with Greece and come back penniless. And in the end, he fools around with a number of the wives of some of his generals and ends up being assassinated by his generals. The readers know this. They're reading this, and it begins this way. This is the king who reigned in 127 provinces. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles and officials from the provinces. He displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. That's half a year, everybody. At the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. White and violet linen hangings were fastened with fine white and purple linen cords to silver rods on marble columns, or alabaster columns. Gold and silver couches were ranged on a mosaic pavement of red feldspar, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in an array of gold goblets, each with a different design. Royal wine flowed freely according to the king's bounty. The drinking was according to the royal decree. There are no restrictions. The king had ordered every wine steward in his household to serve whatever each person wanted. Magnificent splendor. You can feel the exaggeration in the words, can't you? There's like no detail spared. This is like the ritziest, the best. He's displaying all of his riches for half a year, and then at the end of the culmination of this, he's hoping to buy the loyalty of his subjects to go to war. He throws this week-long feast. This is like it's for all the people in the fortress of Susa, from the greatest to the least. Everyone's supposed to show up. This is for everybody, and the wine is flowing like there's a river of wine, so to speak, flowing. And it's interesting because as you look at this, the descriptions that it's including here about all the linens, the silver and the gold, actually maps on. It's ironic, maps on to the descriptions of building the tabernacle and the temple. When Moses receives instructions to putting the tabernacle together, and Solomon builds the temple, the holy space of Israel, it maps on perfectly, nearly perfectly, same words and the things being talked about, the royal colors, the fine linens, the gold, the silver. As you get from further out, from the outside of the tabernacle to further in, it goes from bronze to silver to gold, and here it goes from silver to gold middle. It's a place where originally in the Garden of Eden, the sacred space, humans were supposed to be in relationship with God, feasting with God, right? In the Garden of Eden, you have humans in the very heart of God's good creation with food and with God, with abundance. And in here you have, in these words, you have this pulling together of all these themes of abundance, food, feasting, humans. But it's ironic because Israel is not in the place of abundance of Eden. They're not in the holy place. They're actually in exile. And things are so dark for Israel. Las cosas son tan oscuras para Israel que la cosa más cerca que tienen a un templo es el palacio de un rey pagano. For Israel, the closest thing right here in exile that they have, the closest thing they have to the temple is a pagan king's palace. The closest thing they have to a god is a pagan king. God is not mentioned once, and yet all the descriptions leading into this story, the descriptions are descriptions assigned normally to the temple and to the sacred space of Yahweh, the God of Israel, is now being assigned to this king. And there's this incredible dramatic irony taking place through the whole story. In fact, some scholars actually say that this whole story really should be classified as like a dark comedy. It's actually quite hilarious. It gets better. Everything is caricatured, but it's caricatured in such a way that you realize how dark and how difficult life really was. How wrong things were. Things were so wrong that there was nothing right. It's like one of the prophets talked about how he describes Jerusalem later, and he says Jerusalem is so crooked that people that were standing right side up could not enter into it. This is the situation. It's so dark that the most sacred place they have is the king's palace. So dark that God isn't even mentioned once. The only one who's moving and shaking, the only one who has absolute power in this story is the king of Persia. And guess what Persian kings do when they have tough decisions to make? When they come together for a council to decide on war, when they come together to make important decisions for their kingdom, the first thing they do is they drink until everyone in the council is completely sloshed. Because supposedly that when you are completely drunk and wasted, you are closer to the divine. You have a better ear for the gods. And so Persian kings, as a practice, would get drunk before making any important decisions. So the one figure in the story who has absolute power, anytime an important decision comes to be made, his judgment is not trustworthy. It's ironic. The whole story, the king it's like 6 times throughout the whole story. Every time the king shows up, he's drinking. And this is where the people of Israel find themselves. The story goes on. The king in this week-long banquet, 7 days. 7 days for the God of Israel, the king of all the earth. 7 days was what he created the world in. On the 7th day, he rested. On the 7th day, the king of Persia calls for his queen, Queen Vashti. She's so beautiful, it says. Twice it says he called her because she was beautiful. In fact, she was very beautiful. And so he sends 7 eunuchs who served him personally to go get her. The 7 eunuchs carry his message to Vashti. I don't know why he needed 7, but the whole story is full of gold and royal. It's all about God. It's all about the temple, and 7 is the number of completion or perfection. And so it's on the 7th day, he sends 7 eunuchs to the queen to request that she comes to the banquet. And the queen refuses, a slap in the face to the king of the known world. So the 7 eunuchs come back and they say she won't do it. And so the king is filled with anger and rage. He's in this drunken rage. And he calls his 7 best wise men. And it says that these were his top guys that he consulted about wisdom and justice. These were the guys that anytime there was a matter, right? These were his drinking buddies, essentially. He calls them together, not unlike the way the prophet Zechariah would talk about the 7 eyes of God, that John would later talk about the 7-fold spirit from Isaiah. The spirit of wisdom and understanding for righteousness and justice. These 7 men are the best Persia has to offer. And the advice they give the king is, listen, everyone in your kingdom is going to hear about what Queen Vashti has done. And you know what's going to happen? All the women in our kingdom are going to rebel. Everyone's going to hear about it. And our wives aren't even going to listen to us. They're not going to obey us anymore. We're going to lose control. So they said, here's what you should do. Should sign an edict saying that every man should be the master of his household. Every man should be in charge of his own house. You should banish the queen. She's never to come before you again. And you just take this edict that says every man is supposed to be the master of his own household because Queen Vashti refused the king when he called for her. You're supposed to take that and send it to all 127 provinces. And it says, put it in every language, to every people group, put it on your fastest horses, right? Which is really, really funny when you think about it, because he's afraid that everyone's going to hear about what the king has done. And then inadvertently, when you take the edict that says, hey, this is what happened, and send it to every province in every language, guess what everyone's going to hear? Y'all need to keep your women in check because the king can't. It's funny. It's like, it's hilarious. It's like, oh my gosh, this is so, like the wisdom of Persia is foolishness. It's this dramatic irony. And the king goes, that's a great idea. Let's do that. It's not the first time. The whole story, the king has no ideas of his own. The king has no wisdom of his own. He's constantly saying yes to the suggestion of every person in the story. So they said, let's form a search for a new queen. There's a beauty pageant. They gather all the virgins of the kingdom together, which was not uncommon for Persian kings. Persian kings had access to any woman they wanted. And they would bring the women together, and the women would come in for their one night with the king. And this wasn't an interview. This was for the king to use them. And then they were sent to a separate harem where they became, after that night, they were his concubine. And Esther is caught up in this. Her name is Hadassah in Hebrew. It's used once at the beginning, and then the rest of the story she's referred to as Esther. It says that she was very beautiful. She was an orphan, cared for by her uncle Mordecai, who was a Jewish man who served in the king's court. He sat at the king's gate, is what it says. And he cared for her like she was his own daughter. Well, she is pulled together, brought into the king, into the harem. She's treated, and it says that she actually finds favor with all of these servants, the men in charge of this whole thing. She finds favor with them, and she was very pleasing. She finds grace with everyone who encounters her. She eventually has her night comes, and she comes into the king, and her uncle Mordecai had instructed her, do not share who you are. Don't share your ethnicity. Make sure your ethnicity is a secret, which most likely means that she probably wasn't following the Torah laws like some of the great stories of Daniel and his friends, which makes the story even more complicated because we don't have necessarily a hero here who just stood up and did what was right. No tenemos un héroe que hizo lo que era correcto, ni importa lo que pase. We have a character who actually seems that where Daniel and his friends said, no, we're drawing the line here. We won't bow down. We won't eat the food. We won't do the thing. It seems that Esther most likely didn't do any of those things. She's a character in conflict. For all purposes, for all understanding, she's Babylonian. This is what her uncle instructed her to do. She comes to her night with the king. It says she pleased the king. She was very pleasing to the king. The king loved her. And he was so excited about her that he said, you're going to become the new queen. And he put the royal turban on her head, declared another week of feasting, and she became the new queen in place of Vashti. It's interesting, about this time, her uncle Mordecai hears of a threat to the king's life. Two of the eunuchs who serve the king are planning an assassination plot, and Mordecai just happens to hear of what's happening, and so he sends word to Queen Esther, who's the queen now, and she actually warns the king. And so these two guys, it says, and if you're following along in the story, these two men, it says that they were hanged on the gallows. Now, the word in Hebrew is actually not gallows, it's the word tree. Just the word tree, like any basic tree or shrubbery. That's what the word is. In Hebrew, that word can be used to any wooden thing. And because of kind of a history of translation, many of our translations see it as like a gallows, like a noose, right? Like you get hung. But we don't have, historically, there's no evidence that the Persians actually did executions this way. That wasn't common. Actually, what the Persians did in their time is they would build these super tall wooden poles, and they would impale people on these huge, it's like Dracula, like human skewer. As a warning, as a public, visible warning of what happens when you cross the Persian government. And so what happened to these two men, most likely according to what we know of history, is that they weren't hung on a gallows. They were actually taken out and impaled on these tall poles. It's a rough story. The king is saved. Things continue. Eventually, the king elevates this man named Haman. He elevates him to the highest place of authority underneath the king in the land. We don't know what he did to get that. We just know that he was elevated. And it's not long after this, the king actually issues an edict, and he says, listen, everyone should bow down to Haman because I've elevated him to the highest authority in the land except for me. And so this happens. All the king's court bows down to him. Mordecai in this moment actually refuses to bow before Haman, and Haman is ticked off at it. Some of Mordecai's friends, or lousy friends, they come in and tell Haman, they're like, hey, Mordecai refuses to bow to you, because they're curious, and they knew he was a Jew. And they said, by the way, this Jew Mordecai, he refuses to bow to you. They wanted to see what Haman would do. Haman is furious, and it says in the scriptures there, it says that it was beneath him to just kill Mordecai. He decided in his heart that he was going to eradicate all the Jewish people throughout the kingdom, throughout the 127 provinces. And in this moment, Haman becomes the antagonist of the story. He begins to plan to kill the Jews. And so he begins to cast lots, the pur, in ancient Eastern cultures. It's kind of like a dice. It's kind of like if you're trying to like flip on a coin to figure out what to do, right? Throwing the dice. It's this idea of chance. It's this idea of throwing the dice, and then you, based on what the dice roll, it's an omen or a sign to you. And it says he threw the dice for several months until the month of Adar. He throws the dice, and then it's on that he sees whatever he sees in the chance, his role, he decides to go into the king, and he says, listen, king, there's a people group in this kingdom whose laws are completely different. They don't acknowledge the king. They don't go by Persian law. They have their own set of laws. They do their own thing, live their own way, and they're a danger and a threat to your kingdom. I think we should exterminate them. And so if you'll give me the permission, I'll go ahead and make a plan, and I'll finance it, and we'll do the whole thing. We'll kill them all. And the king, there drinking with Haman, gives the standard, yep, sounds good to me. And Haman leaves and issues a royal edict with the king's signet ring. It cannot be revoked by the law of the Medes and the Persians. It's in writing. There's no walking it back. Everyone in the kingdom, in the 127 provinces, was supposed to prepare for a day to kill every Jewish person and steal their property. They were given time to prepare for this. This story is a comedy, but it's a dark comedy. Like one of the Jewish poet said about the Holocaust, he said, we laugh so that we do not cry. Mordecai leads the way in weeping and lamenting for his people. He leaves the fortress, the king's gate, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and begins to wail and to fast. And all the people, it said, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and began to mourn of what was happening to their people. And Esther's concerned, and so she sends messengers to Mordecai with clothes, and she's like, no, man, get out of those dirty clothes. And he refuses, and so she sends more messengers. What's going on? And he responds and he gives her a copy of the edict that Haman had written in the king's hand. He gives her a copy, and she reads it, and she is distressed. And all of Susa, it says, while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the whole city was thrown into confusion. And Mordecai pleads with Esther. This is his words in chapter 4. Through couriers, they're talking back and forth, and this is what Mordecai pleads with her. He says, listen, you need to plead with the king on behalf of our people to save our people. And she says this. She says, there's only one law that applies to every single person throughout this kingdom. You don't just approach the king unless you are summoned. You can't just approach the king whenever you want. You can't go into the king's courtyard, his inner courtyard. You can't go in anytime you want. He is the one who decides when you come in, and only when he decides. Because if you go in unannounced, if you go in uninvited, you could be killed on the spot. Unless he extends his scepter to you and finds favor with you, you'll be killed on the spot. And Mordecai says this to her. He says to Esther, he responds, says, don't think that you will escape the fate of all the Jews because you are in the king's palace. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jewish people from another place, but you and your father's family will be destroyed. Who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. See, Mordecai and Esther inhabit a world that is built on the question, what if? It's a what if world. People are scheming. Seems like things happen kind of randomly, and chance determines what occurs with the lives of people. And Mordecai's response, it's the closest we get to an acknowledgement of God, any kind of higher power in the story. It's the closest we get. Mordecai says to Esther, he says, perhaps there's something going on here. Pastor Jeremy would call it the power of perhaps. It's kind of like a what if question of its own, but it's not a what if from fear. It's a what if of curiosity, saying, maybe there's an opportunity here. Mordecai says, perhaps you have become queen for such a time as this. Esther sends this reply to Mordecai, verse 16, go and assemble all the Jews who can be found in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my female servants will also fast in the same way. After that, I will go into the king, even if it is against the law. If I perish, I perish. And up until this point, Esther has been obedient to Mordecai and done everything he has told her. And in this moment it says, so Mordecai went and did everything Esther had commanded him. Not unlike with the building of the tabernacle, after God gave Moses instructions, Moses says 7 times did everything Yahweh had commanded him. On the third day, Esther dressed in her royal clothing and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace facing it. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the royal courtroom, which, asterisk, if your Bible might have a note there, it's actually the term house, in the house. She gained favor in his eyes. The king extended the gold scepter in his hand toward Esther, and she approached and touched the tip of the scepter. "What is it, Queen Esther?" the king asked her. "Whatever you want, even to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," Esther replied, "may the king and Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared for them." The king said, "Hurry, get Haman so we can go and do what Esther has requested." It's a dramatic irony. At the very beginning of the story, the king invites a queen to a banquet and she refuses. Now the queen invites the king and the second in command of all the nation, and they hurry to respond and accept. It's also interesting that in this description, we have the description of the inner courtyard of the king. The king is sitting on the throne facing the entrance. The way the tabernacle and the temple were constructed, it was constructed so that the inner place, the Holy of Holies, which was considered to be the footstool of Yahweh, because his throne is above the heavens. You can't see it. So the Ark of the Covenant was like his footstool. His feet rested on the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place in the tabernacle and later the temple. And directly opposite that was the door, the entrance to the holy place, the most sacred place. The temple itself was referred to in the Hebrew language as the house, in short. And so we have here a picture of Esther. She's standing dressed in her royal garments. Turns out the priest, the high priest of Israel, there's all this really intense descriptions of how he's supposed to dress. Guess what he's supposed to dress in? Royal garments. Purple and white linen, with a gold turban on his head. He represents the people to God. He comes in wearing the precious stones on his breastplate. He walks into the holy place once a year, but guess what? He can't enter whenever he wants. Specifically, according to the law in Leviticus, it says that Yahweh says to Moses, the high priest had better not just come in here whenever he wants, because he will be struck dead. He can only come in when I invite him. Once per year, on the Day of Atonement, he can come in. He'll come in before me and make atonement for the people. Esther is dressed in her royal garments with the royal turban on her head. She walks into the holy place, the place where she should die. And the king finds favor with her and extends his scepter. And she intercedes for the lives of her people. These are her words. If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared for them. They end up going into the banquet, to this banquet that she's prepared. And they come. Haman leaves that place full of joy. He's excited because he just realizes the queen just invited me to this exclusive banquet with the king. This is awesome. He leaves. He's bragging. On his way out, he passes Mordecai, who, again, refuses to bow to him, and he's filled with rage. But he controls himself, the scriptures say. And he goes home and he brags to his family about his 10 sons and his whole family about how much honor he's received from the king, and how the queen even has noticed him and has invited just him and the king to this special banquet. But he's like, but I cannot stand this guy, Mordecai. He continues to defy me. And so his family says this, you know what you should do? His wife and his family, you should build another giant stake, 75 feet high. And you should go impale Mordecai on that stake. And then go to the banquet with the king. And he goes, you know what? That sounds like a great idea. It just happens by chance that night, as Haman is building his stake to impale Mordecai, that night the king can't sleep. So he has the chronicles, the records of the day's events, the events of the weeks and months. He has it come to be read to him, and as he's reading this, he hears that it was recorded that Mordecai had learned of a plot to assassinate him and had warned Queen Esther and saved his life. And so he says to the person reading, he says, listen, what's been done for Mordecai? What honor has he received for saving my life? And the servant responds and says, well, nothing. We haven't done anything. And so the next morning, he's sitting in his royal throne room and he says this. He says, who's outside coming into my courtroom? It turns out Haman's on his way in. And the servant says, it's Haman. He says, bring him in. Haman comes in to the king's courtroom. And the king asks him, he says, Haman, what should be done to a man that the king desires to honor? And Haman, this is the only time we really have a character reflecting, we have any kind of motive or any insight into their thoughts. Haman says this, and to himself he says, well, man, who would the king want to honor more than me? You're asking me about me. And so Haman, arrogantly and selfishly, begins to say, he says, well, you know what you should do? You should take the king's best horse, and you should take the best royal clothing, the robe, and you should put it on this man, and you should give him a gold crown on his head, and you should mount him on this horse, and you should have the highest noble in the land should actually lead this man throughout the city proclaiming, this is what is done to the man the king desires to honor. I don't know if the king was chuckling, but all the readers of the story are chuckling right now, because the next thing the king says is, go and do exactly what you have said for Mordecai the Jew. Leave undone nothing that you have said. And Mordecai leaves the king's presence in shame, elevates the man that he was just planning to impale hours later. He goes back home, humiliated, mourning, and his family says to him, if this guy has begun to be elevated and exalted, your days are numbered, dude. It's prophetic, because in the next moment, Haman comes into the second banquet, prepared. It says the king and Haman came to, it says to feast, but it's actually literally the words to drink. The king and Haman came to drink once again with Esther the queen. Once again, on the second day, while drinking wine, the king asked Esther, Queen Esther, whatever you ask will be given to you, whatever you seek, even to half the kingdom, will be done. Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your eyes, your majesty, and if the king is pleased, spare my life. That is my request. And spare my people. This is my desire. For my people have been sold to destruction, death, and extermination. And this is where the irony gets thicker. These next words, she says, if we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept silent. Indeed, the trouble wouldn't be worth burdening the king. And she's right. The king in this story does not care if her people are going to be enslaved. Doesn't even care if they're going to die, honestly. But the king in this story who is absent, who is never mentioned once, the king to whom all earthly authority corresponds, is ironically the one who was burdened that his people would be sold as female and male slaves. And actually, he moves heaven and earth to rescue the nation of Israel from slavery in Egypt in the Exodus. The king of all the earth says that is a burden worth getting angry over. That is a tragedy worth doing something about. So the king of Persia spoke up and asked Queen Esther, who is this and who is the one who devised such a scheme? She points out Haman. Haman ends up immediately being arrested, and one of the king's eunuchs says, hey, look, just so happens there's a 75-foot tall pole out in Haman's backyard that he was going to impale Mordecai. And the king orders that he be impaled on that very stick. From this moment on, Esther again intercedes with the king for the lives of all the Jews. This edict has already gone out. People have already prepared to exterminate all the Jews throughout the land. His law cannot be repealed. But Esther's suggestion, once again, at Esther's suggestion, Esther runs the whole idea here. Her and Mordecai have the king sign a new edict, this time issued in the king's hand again with his signet ring. They can't go back and erase what was, but the king actually provides for the Jewish people to be able to actually prepare to defend themselves. And they have the king's blessing to attack the people who come to attack them. And in this moment, the whole nation is saved. Mordecai is given all of Haman's belongings. He's given his place. He's given the king's signet ring that Mordecai had, and he's elevated to the place of honor. It says this in verse 15 of chapter 8. Mordecai went from the king's presence clothed in royal purple and white, with a great gold crown and purple robe of fine linen, dressed like a king. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced, and the Jews celebrated with gladness, joy, and honor. In every province and every city where the king's command and his law reached, it says, joy and rejoicing took place among the Jews. There was celebration and a holiday. That word celebrate, the Jews celebrated with gladness, is actually the word for light. The Jews had light. There was celebration and a holiday, a good day is what it says. And many of the ethnic groups of the land professed themselves to be Jews because fear of the Jews had overcome them. Where there was darkness, there is now light. Where there was mourning, there's gladness. It goes on, chapter 9, verse 20. It says, Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews in all of King Ahasuerus' provinces, both near and far. He ordered that this day be a celebration day, to celebrate the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar every year, because during those days the Jews gained relief from their enemies. That was the month when their sorrow was turned into rejoicing and their mourning into a holiday. They were to be days of feasting, rejoicing, and of sending gifts to one another and to the poor. All of those things are temple activities. Rejoicing, feasting, and the giving of gifts to one another and to the poor, temple activities. So the Jews agreed to continue the practice they had begun as Mordecai had written them to do. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them. He cast the poor, that is, the lot, to crush and destroy them. But when the matter was brought before the king, he commanded by letter that the evil plan Haman had devised against the Jews return on his own head, and that he should be impaled with his sons on the spikes. For this reason, these days are called Purim, from the word pur, because all the instructions of this letter, as well as what they had witnessed and what had happened to them, the Jews bound themselves, their descendants, and all who joined with them to a commitment that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days each and every year according to the Torah and according to the appointed times. These days are remembered and celebrated by every generation, family, province, and city, so that these days of chance, these days of the gamble, these days of random occurrences will not lose their significance in Jewish life, and their memory will not fade from their descendants. There's one other day in the Jewish festivals, in their liturgy, there's one other day where lots are cast. This day is called the Festival of Lots. It's the day of chance. It's the day of rolling the dice. It's the day of the gamble. But there's one other day where the dice are cast, the lots are thrown, and it's the Day of Atonement. It's that day when the high priest walks into the most sacred place to atone for the people. Dice are cast. God sends Israel's sin into the desert, into the place of death, into the wasteland, does away with their sin, takes it as far as the east is away from the west. He removes their sin from them. But the question is, what if you live in that place? What if you sit in darkness? What if you sit in the place, in the wasteland? There's no life. Everything is wrong. Nothing's right. I wouldn't even know what right is if it was looking at me. I can't see God's faithfulness. The story of Esther is this dark, comedic reminder that if you are sitting in the place of darkness, everything is upside down. God only needs one even if person to turn a whole world of what ifs upside down. The whole story is turned on its head. If we could throw the image of the structure of the book of Esther up really fast. you can't improve on the Bible Project's description of this scene. The very first 2 chapters, the king of Persia's greatness is then contrasted by Mordecai's greatness. Haman is elevated in the 3rd chapter. Mordecai is elevated in the 8th chapter. The whole book is, again, like a chiasm. It all works to this center place. It says it. God turned the whole story on its head when Esther said, even if I perish, even if I walk into death. She walked in as a priest, as the high priest, into the most holy place and made intercession for her people. And she found grace. And she's a woman. You're not even supposed to be a priest as a woman. It's so wrong. The whole thing is wrong. The whole story is wrong. And yet God is faithful in the midst of darkness. He's faithful when there's not a shred of light. He is faithful. He's faithful when you can't even hear his name. He's faithful. He's behind the scenes. In Proverbs 16:33, it says that the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is Yahweh's. Every decision is Yahweh's. So it doesn't matter what situation we sit in. It doesn't matter if it's all wrong. It doesn't matter if we know what right or wrong is. We can trust that the one who holds the world is working all things out for good, and he wants to participate with those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. I don't know where we find ourselves. I don't know what your situation is. But I know right now, in our world, there is a lot of darkness and a lot of opinions. And we're coming into a season full of what ifs. Doesn't matter what your opinion is. The whole system is built on what if. And I think God is forming a community of people who like Esther, who like the high priest, who like the ultimate high priest. The book of Hebrews talked about. Ted, thank you for sharing from Hebrews today. Faith is the substance of things not hope, or substance of things hoped for, the evidence of what we cannot see. You cannot see God in the book of Esther. But faith says he's there. Faith says he's authoring it all. Hebrews will go on to say that there's one high priest who's better than any high priest Israel ever had. Better than all the priests, better than Israel as a nation, better than Esther, because this high priest actually walked into the holy place, not just the holy place that was a shadow of the earth, the reality. But like Esther, he walks into death, camina hasta la muerte, para dar intercesión para nosotros en el lugar santísimo. No el lugar santísimo que era una copia, sino el lugar original en los cielos. It was the place, the original place, the sacred space of heaven and earth, where heaven and earth come together. The temple, the tabernacle, all of that was a copy. It was a shadow that pointed to the real thing. In the book of Hebrews says this. It says that Jesus went into the real holy place and he offered up his life, his blood as sacrifice. Just like Esther, he walked into death, but unlike Esther, he actually died. And won greats. He touched the tip of the scepter. Won grace for you and for me. For the whole world. Not just a people group. Not just a tribe, not just a language. Not just one opinion, one version. For the whole world. And that's what he's inviting us into in this moment. The King of all the earth is a true king. He doesn't get drunk every time he makes an important decision. He's the real king. He's burdened by our slavery. He's burdened by our lives. He's burdened by our questions of what if. And I think that we as a community, what if we as a community became a community where our even if became God's response to the what if cries of those doomed for destruction all around us. Esther's even if was God's response to the cries of her people, saying, what if we are exterminated? What if we lose it all? What if God's promises fail? Esther's resolve, her even if, was God's response. I don't fail. I don't fail. I am faithful I will go to hell and back. And I will turn hell itself into a garden if you will just trust me and say yes to me. Esther treated the profane as if it were sacred. Israel constantly treated the sacred as if it was profane. But Esther walks into the Holy of Holies. It's no Holy of Holies at all. It's the palace of the king of Persia. But it's the closest thing they have, which is the complete opposite. But Esther walks into that place and treats it as if it's the most sacred place, as a priest of God. She walks into the den of hell itself as a priest of God and turns it into the temple of God by her presence. It becomes a new space. It becomes a garden in a wasteland. The very thing that God said he would do. And the result is Psalm 30. Psalm 30 says this. It's actually the psalm of dedication for God's house, for the temple. It begins with, if you could throw that first verse up. It's a psalm of dedication, a song for the house from David. I will exalt you, Lord, because you have lifted me up and have not allowed my enemies to triumph over me. The last two verses. Next. You turn my lament into dancing. You remove my sackcloth and clothe me with gladness so that I will sing to you and not be silent. Lord my God, I will praise you forever. I don't know where you are. All I know is this, that if for you, you feel like you're in the darkest place, you don't have wisdom to know what's right, to know what to do, if sometimes you feel like me, I wouldn't know what faithfulness looked like if it was staring me in the face. And maybe we, like Esther, can fall at the feet of Jesus, of our God, plead for mercy for us, plead for mercy for our people, plead for mercy for our enemies, that God would turn the profane place into the sacred space, that we would become a people marked by him. Everywhere we go, the sacred space follows and it goes ahead of us. I'd like for us to pray for just a moment. And you know your story, you know the problems, you know the struggle, you know where you're at. And if you're in the room today and you haven't walked with Jesus yet, and I just want to encourage you, we're going to pray together. All we have to do is say yes to him, like Esther, to throw everything we have in with him. I can tell you it's more sure than a game of Texas Hold'em. It doesn't depend on your ability to see the odds and figure it out. He's already done it, and he just wants you to hold his hand and to walk with him. Our job is not to wield our privilege and our power for the kingdom. God doesn't need that. Our job is to surrender any privilege and power we have so that he can wield it for his kingdom. And if you're tired striving on your own and working on your own to do the right thing and to figure it out, to do what's right, then this might be the moment just to surrender to Jesus and say, Jesus, I need your wisdom. Here's my life. Here's my influence. Here's everything I have. It can die. I give it to you. And if I perish, I perish. Because there's resurrection on the other side of death. And he will do it. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we ask you right now in your holy name, have mercy on us, God, for our blindness. We live in a world built on what ifs, and so much of my own life and our life is full of what if. But God, I want to be defined by your even if, because I know it just takes one, and you can flip a whole world on its head. You can work a whole story backwards, but not actually backwards to undo, but forward towards a better future. And so, Father, for each and every one of us, as we say yes to you in this moment, perhaps it's knowing you for the first time and just getting to know you and responding to you. Perhaps it's turning over another part of our life to you. In this moment, God, we hold it up and we give it to you. Jesus, take us, take our whole lives. Forgive us of our rebellion. Forgive us of our ways of holding on to the life we want. And we ask that you would make us new on the inside. Deliver us from our enemies without, and deliver us from ourselves. Deliver us from the enemy within. May we be your people to walk in your ways. May we continue to turn places of darkness through our yes to you, where they become places of light. It's in your powerful name we pray. Amen.